There was a time when food went bad quickly. Milk soured, bread grew mold, fruit turned soft and dark within days. This wasn't seen as a flaw, it was understood as proof that something had been alive. And then, gradually, that stopped being acceptable. Not because people demanded it, but because the system required something else. It required food that could wait, food that could travel, food that could sit under lights in a warehouse, on a truck, on a shelf, and still look the same 6 months later. So we changed what food was. We didn't ask if we should, we asked if we could. And the answer was yes. What we didn't ask was what that would cost. By the mid-20th century, the Western diet had begun to shift in ways that seemed convenient, modern, and scientific. Packaged goods filled aisles that had once held bulk grains and loose produce. Bread stayed soft for weeks. Crackers never went stale. Milk sat unrefrigerated in boxes. Cheese came wrapped in plastic, sliced into perfect squares and didn't mold. These were celebrated as triumphs. Housewives were told they were being liberated from the kitchen. Families were told they were being given more time. The message was clear. Fresher wasn't better. Longer was better. Stability was better. Convenience was progress. The language around food began to change too. Ingredients were no longer just ingredients, they became components, formulations, systems. A loaf of bread was no longer flour, water, yeast, and salt. It was a delivery mechanism for calcium propionate, datum, monoglycerides, and azodicarbamide. These names didn't appear on the front of the package. They were tucked into fine print on the back, written in a language most people didn't speak. And because the food still looked like bread, tasted roughly like bread, and was called bread, it was accepted as bread. No one asked what had been added or why. Oils changed. Butter, lard, and tallow, fats humans had eaten for millennia, were replaced by margarine, shortening, and refined seed oils. These new fats were cheaper to produce, didn't spoil, and could withstand high heat in industrial fryers. They were marketed as heart-healthy, modern, scientific. The old fats were declared dangerous, not because new evidence had emerged, but because new industries had. Soybeans, corn, and cottonseed could be grown at scale, processed into oil, and sold at margins that animal fats couldn't match. So the science followed the economics, and the public followed the science. Sugar was hidden. It no longer appeared only in desserts and candy. It was in bread, in soup, in sauce, in salted crackers, in cured meat. It appeared under different names: high fructose corn syrup, dextrose, maltodextrin, evaporated cane juice, so that even those reading labels wouldn't notice how much they were consuming. The taste of food shifted. Sweetness became the baseline. Anything that wasn't sweet tasted bland, and so more was added, not because it made the food better, but because it made people eat more. Preservatives became standard: sodium benzoate, potassium sorbate, BHA, BHT, TBHQ. These chemicals extended the life of food indefinitely. A Twinkie could sit in a warehouse for years and still be sold as fresh. A bag of chips could cross the ocean and still crunch. The food didn't rot, it didn't attract insects, it didn't break down. And so it was assumed to be safe, because if nature wouldn't eat it, how could it be harmful to us? The animals changed too. Chickens that once took 16 weeks to mature were engineered to reach full size in 6. Cows were confined to feedlots and fed grain instead of grass, which their stomachs were not designed to digest. Antibiotics were added to their feed, not to treat illness but to prevent it and to make them grow faster. The meat that came from these animals was different, fattier, paler, less nutrient-dense, but it was cheaper, and it was abundant. and so it became normal. Vegetables were bred for appearance, not nutrition. Tomatoes were developed to be firm enough to survive mechanical harvesting and long-distance shipping. They were picked green and ripened with ethylene gas. They looked red, they looked ripe, but they had half the vitamin C of the tomatoes grown 50 years earlier. The same was true for spinach, broccoli, and carrots. The food looked the same, but it had been optimized for a supply chain, not for a body. Flavor was engineered. Natural flavors and artificial flavors were created in labs to make cheap ingredients taste expensive. A strawberry yogurt no longer needed strawberries. It needed strawberry flavor, red dye, and thickeners. The taste was close enough. The color was bright enough. The texture was smooth enough. And because it was cheaper to produce, it was sold in larger quantities at lower prices in more locations. People began to forget what a strawberry tasted like when it wasn't processed. They forgot what food tasted like when it was just food. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was a convergence. Food companies wanted profit. Farmers wanted efficiency. Regulators wanted stability. Scientists wanted solutions. Consumers wanted convenience. And so the system optimized for all of those things. It did not optimize for health. That wasn't the goal. The goal was scale. And scale required food that didn't spoil, didn't vary, and didn't cost much to make. So that's what was built. What disappeared wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, gradual, unannounced. Nutrients were the first to go. Not all at once, but bite by bite, crop by crop, decade by decade. The vitamin content of produce dropped. In 1950, a bowl of spinach contained significantly more iron, calcium, and vitamin C than the same bowl in the year 2000. The soil had been depleted. The plants had been bred for yield, not nutrition. The food still looked green. It still filled the stomach, but it no longer fed the body the way it once had. And because no one measured what was missing, no one noticed it was gone. Fiber was reduced. Whole grains were stripped of their bran and germ, leaving only the starchy endosperm. This made the flour whiter, softer, and more shelf-stable. But it also removed most of the fiber, the B vitamins, and the minerals. White bread became the standard. Brown bread became niche, and the average person's fiber intake dropped from over 30 grams per day to less than 15. Digestion slowed, blood sugar spiked, hunger returned more quickly, but the food was softer, sweeter, easier to chew, so it sold. Fermentation disappeared. Bread was no longer leavened slowly with wild yeast and bacteria. It was risen quickly with commercial yeast and dough conditioners. Vegetables were no longer preserved through lacto-fermentation. They were pickled in vinegar or preserved with sodium benzoate. Dairy was pasteurized at high temperatures, killing not only harmful bacteria, but beneficial ones as well. The microbes that had once populated food, and by extension the human gut, were eradicated. The food became sterile, stable, safe by one definition, but also dead. Complexity was removed. Meals that once required multiple ingredients and hours of preparation were replaced by products that required only a microwave. A casserole became a frozen tray. A stew became a can. A roast became a pre-seasoned, pre-cooked, vacuum-sealed pouch. The labor was outsourced. The knowledge was lost. And the eater became dependent on a system they no longer understood. Animal fats were replaced, not just in cooking, but in the animal itself. Grain-fed beef had a different fatty acid profile than grass fat. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio shifted dramatically. Where it had once been roughly balanced, it became wildly skewed, sometimes 20 to 1, 30 to 1. The body, which had evolved to handle a certain ratio, was now flooded with inflammatory fats. But the meat was marbled. It was tender. It looked premium. So it was sold as premium. Seasonal eating ended. Strawberries in December, tomatoes in February, greens flown in from another hemisphere. The body, which had once cycled through periods of abundance and scarcity, now had access to everything, all the time. This seemed like wealth, but it also removed a rhythm, a balance, a reason to preserve, to ferment, to store. Food became a constant, and with that constancy came a kind of monotony. Traditional preparation methods were abandoned. Grains were no longer soaked or sprouted before cooking, which would have neutralized phytic acid and made minerals more bioavailable. Beans were no longer cooked slowly with kombu. Bone broths were replaced with bouillon cubes. These methods had existed for reasons, not superstition, but accumulated knowledge about how to make food more digestible, more nourishing, less harsh on the gut. But they took time, and time was no longer something the food system had. Taste itself was replaced, not eliminated, but replicated, made predictable, standardized. A cookie no longer tasted like butter, flour, and sugar. It tasted like vanillin, palm oil, and high fructose corn syrup. The difference was subtle, but it was there. And over time, palates adjusted. Children grew up thinking that was what a cookie tasted like. They didn't know what had been replaced because they'd never tasted the original. The culture of food disappeared too. Meals were no longer events. They were fuel stops. Eating was done alone, in cars, at desks, in front of screens. The social aspect, the gathering, the conversation, the ritual was stripped away, and with it went a certain kind of awareness. When you eat alone, quickly, while distracted, you don't notice what you're eating. You don't notice how it makes you feel. You don't notice when something is wrong.
The body kept score. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment when the system broke. But over decades, patterns emerged. Patterns that were treated as separate problems, unrelated conditions, isolated failures. But they weren't isolated. They were connected. And the connection was what had changed in the food. Obesity rates began to climb in the 1980s. Not slowly, sharply. Within 2 decades, the percentage of obese adults in the United States more than doubled. This wasn't blamed on the food. It was blamed on the people. They were told they were eating too much, moving too little, lacking willpower. But the food had changed. It was engineered to be hyper-palatable, to override satiety signals, to trigger dopamine responses in the brain that made people want more even when they were full. The portions grew larger, the calorie density increased, but the nutrient density dropped. So people ate more, felt hungrier, and gained weight. And they were told it was their fault. Gut health collapsed. Rates of irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and celiac disease all increased. The microbiome, the community of bacteria living in the digestive tract, was disrupted. Antibiotics in food, preservatives in food, a lack of fiber, a lack of fermented foods. The diversity of gut bacteria dropped, and with it, the body's ability to digest food, produce vitamins, regulate mood, and manage inflammation. The gut, which had once been a thriving ecosystem, became a barren landscape. Inflammation became chronic. Not the acute inflammation that helps the body heal from injury, but low-grade systemic inflammation that never turned off. It was driven by the omega-6 fats in seed oils, the refined sugars, the lack of omega-3s, the processed ingredients that the immune system didn't recognize as food. This inflammation was linked to heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, autoimmune disorders, depression. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. But it was there, quietly damaging tissues, day after day, meal after meal.
Allergies increased. Food allergies, which had been uncommon, became routine. Peanut allergies, dairy allergies, gluten sensitivity. Theories varied: hygiene hypothesis, over-sanitization, environmental toxins. But one possibility was rarely discussed: that the food itself had changed. That proteins in genetically modified crops, or residues from pesticides or additives used as emulsifiers, were triggering immune responses. The body was reacting to something, and that something was in the food. Mental health declined. Depression and anxiety rates rose in parallel with changes in diet. The gut-brain axis, the communication pathway between the digestive system and the brain, was disrupted. Serotonin, which regulates mood, is produced primarily in the gut. When the gut was damaged, serotonin production dropped. Neurotransmitter balance shifted. The brain, which relied on nutrients like B vitamins, omega-3s, and magnesium, was being starved. Not of calories, but of the building blocks it needed to function. And so people felt worse, not because they were weak, but because they were malnourished. Fertility dropped. Sperm counts declined by more than 50% over 50 years. Rates of polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, and miscarriage increased. Hormones were being disrupted by plastics in packaging, by pesticides on produce, by additives in processed food. The body's endocrine system, which had evolved over millennia to respond to natural signals, was being flooded with synthetic chemicals that mimicked estrogen, blocked testosterone, and interfered with reproductive function. And again, this was treated as a separate issue, not as part of a pattern. Children's health worsened. ADHD diagnoses increased. Autism rates climbed. Childhood obesity became common. Type 2 diabetes appeared in teenagers. These were not inevitable. These were new. And while the causes were complex, one variable had changed across all of them: what children were being fed. Baby formula replaced breast milk, juice replaced water, snacks replaced meals, and the food that was marketed to children, brightly colored, heavily sweetened, fortified with synthetic vitamins, was some of the most processed in the system. The generation raised on it became the first to have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. Trust eroded, not in science, but in institutions. People were told margarine was healthier than butter. Then they were told it wasn't. They were told eggs were dangerous. Then they were told they weren't. They were told fat made you fat. Then they were told sugar did. The guidelines changed, the studies contradicted each other, and the food kept getting worse. So people stopped listening. They stopped trusting. And in the absence of trust, they turned to influencers, to trends, to elimination diets and pseudoscience. Because if the experts had been wrong before, why believe them now? The cost was passed down, not just in dollars, though healthcare spending ballooned, but in bodies, in habits, in the baseline of what was considered normal. A child born in 2020 would grow up in a world where chronic illness was common, where medication was routine, where feeling good was the exception. And they wouldn't know it could be different, because they'd never experienced different. The shift had been so gradual, so complete, that it no longer looked like a shift. It looked like reality. There was no single villain, no moment when someone decided to harm an entire population. What happened was quieter than that. It was a system optimizing for the wrong things, optimizing for profit, for scale, for shelf life, for convenience. And in that optimization, something was lost, something essential. The food stopped nourishing. It stopped being food in the way food had been understood for most of human history. It became a product, engineered, standardized, distributed, consumed. And the people eating it didn't realize what had been taken because it happened slowly, and because the alternative was no longer available. You can't miss what you've never known,
And an entire generation grew up never knowing. They grew up eating from boxes, from bags, from drive-through windows. They grew up thinking that was normal, that food was supposed to last forever, that ingredients were supposed to be unpronounceable, that eating was supposed to be fast, easy, and cheap. And by the time the consequences appeared, by the time the weight wouldn't come off, the gut wouldn't settle, the mood wouldn't lift, it was hard to trace it back, because everything had changed. Not just the food, but the culture, the knowledge, the expectations. The thread had been severed. And yet, some people remembered. Some people kept cooking the old way, fermenting, sprouting, rendering fat, baking bread that went stale in 2 days. They were called traditionalists, purists, out of touch. But they were also healthier, not because they were special, but because they were eating food that hadn't been designed for a supply chain, food that had been designed over centuries for a body. And slowly others began to notice, to ask questions, to read labels, to wonder why the food in their grandmother's kitchen looked so different from the food in theirs. This is not a story with a clean ending. The system is still in place, the food is still engineered, the consequences are still unfolding. But there is a shift, a quiet one, a growing awareness that something was lost, and that maybe, just maybe, it can be found again. Not by going backward, but by remembering what forward was supposed to mean. Not longer shelf life, but longer life. This is one chapter. There are others.